Roughly 200 German soldiers held Pointe du Hoc on the morning of June 6, 1944. Most of them were not watching the sea. The garrison had dug its trenches, sighted its machine guns, and turned its strongest defenses inland toward the fields and the coastal road because that was the direction an attack was supposed to come from. The cliff facing the channel, 100 feet of near vertical rock, was left to defend itself. The decision made sense. The rock dropped to the water at close to 90 degrees, broken only by a thin strip of shingle that vanished at high tide. A man trying to climb it would be exposed the whole way up, slow, weighed down, with nowhere to take cover and nothing useful to shoot back with. German planners looked at that face and saw a wall that needed almost no one to defend it. They were not wrong about the wall. They were wrong about the men who would come at it. What sat on top was worth defending. 6 155mm guns, taken from the French in 1940 and pressed into German service, stood in concrete pits with a reach close to 20,000 yards. From that height, they could put shells onto Utah Beach to the west and Omaha Beach to the east, onto the landing craft, the men waiting ashore, the ships standing offshore to cover them. The battery answered to the 2nd Battery of Army Coastal Artillery Battalion 1260, with infantry from 352nd Division dug in around it. On many of the maps and aerial photographs the Americans carried that morning, the position was labeled Pointe du Hoc. A translation slip had turned the C into an E somewhere in the chain, and nobody had bothered to fix it. Allied planners studied those photographs and reached one conclusion. The guns had to be gone before the first man set foot on either beach. The job went to the 2nd Ranger Battalion and a man named James Earl Rudder, a Texas schoolteacher and football coach before the war, who had trained these men to do one impossible thing: come straight up that cliff. 225 of them would make the first assault, 3 companies, D, E, and F, in armored British landing craft. They carried rocket-fired grapnels that trailed ropes, plain rope, and sectional steel ladders built in 4-foot lengths. Trailing the first wave came 4 amphibious trucks, 2 of them mounting 100-foot extension ladders borrowed from the London Fire Brigade. The plan came apart before the first rope went up. The lead craft, steered by a British coxswain, ran toward the wrong headland, Pointe de la Percée, 3 miles east. By the time the mistake was caught and the small flotilla swung west and ran the coastline under fire, the Rangers were close to 40 minutes late. Those 40 minutes outweighed anything that happened on the water. The naval bombardment had been timed to lift at 0630, the moment the assault was meant to land. It came ashore nearer to 0710. For more than half an hour, the cliff top belonged to the Germans again, and they used the time to climb out of their shelters and reman the edge. A DKW packed with ammunition took a 20mm shell on the run-in and went down. One landing craft swamped in the chop and sank with most of the men aboard. A single survivor came out of the water. At the base, the killing started before anyone touched the rock. A German machine gun firing across the beach from the left flank cut down about 15 men as they crossed the open shingle. The ropes failed next. Seawater had soaked them through, and wet rope is heavy. So, of the grapnels fired, only 19 of 54 caught and held. Men stood on that narrow shelf under grenades pitched from above and started up anyway. A few climbed with their hands, cutting holds into the soft clay with their knives. The good climbers had been sent up first. One of the trucks managed to raise its fire ladder. Staff Sergeant William Stivison rode it to the top, 100 feet of swaying steel that swung close to 45 degrees each way, firing twin machine guns at the cliff edge each time the arc carried him over it. Lieutenant Elmer Vermeer watched from below and said, "The truck floundered so badly they had to bring the whole thing down again." The destroyer Satterlee stood close inshore and raked the lip of the cliff with its guns. The battleship Texas had already done something stranger. Its shells brought down a slab of the cliff face, leaving a 40-foot mound of rubble that a handful of Rangers used to start their climb partway up. The Germans at the edge did what they could. They leaned over the lip and cut the ropes with knives and bayonets, and they rolled potato masher grenades down onto the beach. Rifle fire came down the rock in bursts. There were not many of them up there, a scattering of riflemen and a machine gun crew or two, because the cliff had never been meant to be held by many. It was meant to hold itself. Within 5 minutes of the first man cresting the top, Rangers were over the edge. Within half an hour, most of the assault force had made it up and was spreading out toward the gun positions each company had memorized from sand table models built back in England. The casemates were empty. Where the 155s should have stood were telephone poles. The Germans had set heavy wooden poles into the emplacements at an angle, painted to read as gun barrels from the air, and the trick had held all the way through the last reconnaissance flight. It was, in its way, a good piece of work. The guns themselves had been hauled off in April after a heavy raid that spring, towed inland and away from the bombing while the decoys stayed behind to keep Allied bombers spending their loads on empty concrete. The ruse had worked on the bombers, and it had worked just as well on the planners. Now it left a battalion standing on its objective with half the job done, looking at painted poles, the real guns somewhere it could not see. Most people won't look this up on their own. That's what this channel is for. Subscribe if you want to keep going. The decision that would leave them alone had already been made, out at sea. More than 800 Rangers, the rest of the force, had been circling offshore waiting for word that the point had been taken, a pair of flares or a code word over the radio that would bring them in behind the assault. The plan had a clock on it. If no signal came by a set minute, the offshore commander was to assume the worst and land his men at Omaha instead. The late start threw the timing off, and what reached the ships came too late and too garbled to trust. By the time the men on the cliff stood in the empty gun pits, those 800 had already turned for the beaches. Rudder set up a command post in a crater near the cliff edge and pushed men inland after what the casemates were missing. The guns had been towed somewhere still inside range of the beaches, and someone had to walk into the fields and find them. 2 men did. First Sergeant Leonard Lomel and Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn of D Company followed a sunken farm lane south, away from the point, reading the heavy wheel tracks that artillery leaves in soft ground. About a quarter mile in, the first sergeant put out a hand to halt Kuhn and looked into a hedged orchard. 5 of the 6 guns stood there in a line under camouflage netting, barrels raised, aimed west toward Utah Beach, ammunition stacked beside them, ready to fire. In his own account of the moment, Lomel said only that there they were, the goddamned guns. Germans were close by, perhaps 100 of them gathered in a field just across the orchard, near enough that the 2 sergeants could hear them talking. No one was guarding the guns. Lomel took the grenades Kuhn was carrying, told him to cover the lane, and went in alone. He set thermite into the recoil and traversing mechanisms of 2 of the pieces, where the burning metal would run down into the gears and weld them solid, then smash the sights of a 3rd with the butt of his Thompson. He went back for more, and by the time he returned, a patrol from E Company had finished the rest. By 9 that morning, the guns that could have ranged the American beaches were scrap. The single most important thing the Rangers had been sent to do was finished by a 2-man patrol with a satchel of incendiary grenades in a French orchard, while the cliff they had climbed sat empty behind them. For decades afterward, a particular argument attached itself to Pointe du Hoc, that the Rangers had climbed and bled and died for nothing, since the guns were never even on the point. The argument misses what Lomel found in the orchard. The guns had not been disabled by the Germans. They had been displaced, and they were live, loaded, and pointed at a beach where American soldiers were coming ashore at that very hour. The 6th gun was never found. It does not turn up in any account of the orchard, and it does not turn up in the wreckage the Rangers left. The record simply stops mentioning it. Destroying the guns ended the mission and began the worst part of the day. The men on the point were a light battalion with almost no heavy weapons, holding an exposed scrap of headland, while the rest of the 5th Rangers and most of the planned support had been drawn off to Omaha, where the landing had gone worse than anyone had prepared for. Through the afternoon, the Germans counterattacked. By nightfall, the perimeter had been pushed back to something barely 200 yards across, a ring of craters on the lip of the cliff with the sea at its back. The radios were weak, and the help that was supposed to come up from the beaches was fighting for its own survival miles away. Reinforcement did not come. They held the ground for 2 days. They held it on captured German weapons when their own ammunition ran low, in the same craters the bombing had dug, against attacks that came in the dark and were thrown back at close range. A platoon of about 23 men fought through to the point on the first night, the only help Rudder got that day. The worst of it came in the small hours of June 7th, when German infantry pushed at the thin perimeter in strength and were held off at arm's length. Wounded himself, Rudder kept the line together and sent word back to the fleet that the point was taken and the mission done, asking for ammunition, men, and aid for a great many casualties. The message went out, and the night came down, and the attacks kept coming. 225 Rangers had come ashore at the foot of the cliff on the morning of the 6th. When relief reached the point around noon on June 8th, about 90 of them could still fight. The exact tally of dead and wounded shifts a little from one source to the next, the way these numbers do, but every version of it lands in the same place. Most of the men who climbed were no longer standing when it was over. Pointe du Hoc is remembered for the climb. The pictures that survive show ropes against a cliff face and men hauling themselves up under fire, and that is the image that fixed itself in memory. The thing that actually settled the matter happened a quarter-mile inland in an orchard when a wounded sergeant melted the gears of 2 field guns with thermite, while 100 enemy soldiers stood in the next field and never once looked his way. The cliff kept its place in the story. The guns it was built to protect were gone before the first Ranger reached the top, and the 2 men who finished them off are not the part anyone thinks to draw.